Kevin Chong is the author of 6 books, including the memoir My Year of the Racehorse and the novels Beauty Plus Pity and Barocca Nova. His work has been published in Canada, the US, France, Australia, and Macedonia, and has been shortlisted for the Hubert Evans Fiction Prize and a National Magazine Award. He lives in Vancouver, where he teaches at the University of British Columbia in the creative writing program, as well as the writer's studio at Simon Fraser University. So please welcome Kevin Chong.
Hi. It's very nice to see everyone. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see the familiar faces here too and old friends. I'm going to read from near the beginning of my book, The Plague, which is kind of like my cover version of a classic novel by Albert Camus and published in 1947. This, again, takes place early in the novel, and as in the original, the onset of this disease in the city starts with the discovery of some dead rats. And I think the rest is pretty self-explanatory, and I guess I'll interrupt if I need to explain anything. The phone rang. It was the seldom used landline, a number called only by telemarketers, and the woman who was now in the kitchen. "I'm fine, Dr. Ryu," a voice announced. "Mr. Santos," Ryu asked. "Do not worry about me," the building superintendent said. His breathing was heavy. "My wife worries too much. Are you not feeling well?" The sound of coughing filled Ryu's ear. "Mrs. Ryu looked very good today," Mr. Santos said once he'd cleared his throat. "Is she going on a vacation?" "She's in Mexico until the new year." "An extended holiday, how nice. It's too bad doctors have such busy schedules." "Indeed. As you can tell, I'm feeling better as I speak. I won't take too much of your time. Enjoy your evening." As Ryu puzzled over the phone call, Mrs. Ryu prepared macaroni and broth with shredded ham and peas, a Chinese diner specialty. Her preference would have been to make a proper Cantonese meal, but first she would have to shop. She asked her son for bus directions to the nearest Chinese grocer. He worried that she'd have too much to carry and said they could go together. She drew a hand against her forehead. "I forgot that I packed sausage in my luggage," she told him in Cantonese. "We have that here," he answered in English. "You'll see when we get to the store. We can pick up some items, clothes, toiletries tomorrow morning. It won't be long before your luggage is retrieved." "You're already too busy. I'm here to help you." "It's no trouble," he lied. This was the extent of their conversation. As it had been in his youth, the meal was so devoid of chatter that every slurp and clink of spoons against bowls seemed to form its own language. At least in his youth, his mother could ask him and his sister about schoolwork. This was the first time she'd seen him in a year, and she would be here at least until January. Unless he insisted, she would not go sightseeing or visit with her friends. She would watch her Chinese TV shows through an elaborate black box, whose installation Ryu had arranged last week. They would eat together silently, and this would be the extent of their time together. A firecracker went off nearby, causing Mrs. Ryu to shudder. "Should we call the police? It's Halloween," Ryu told her. "Oh, I'd forgotten about these customs," she said. Ryu had begun to explain the peculiarity of firecrackers at Halloween when the landline rang again. This time it was Mr. Santos' wife. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said. "My husband is unwell, but he refuses to visit the hospital." It took Ryu a moment to understand what had happened. Mr. and Mrs. Santo had argued about calling Ryu. Mr. Santo had called him preemptively, thinking Ryu had already spoken to his wife. Mrs. Santos described symptoms that resembled the flu. Dr. Ryu said he would be down immediately. Normally he would have advised Mrs. Santos to take her husband to the hospital, but he knew how stubborn the man could be. "I have to speak to the superintendent," Ryu told his mother. While her back was turned, he retrieved the bicycle saddlebags where he kept some medical equipment. The Santos' suite was similar to Ryu's, though their patio view offered more of the commuter traffic than the mountains. Mrs. Santo led Ryu to the living room. Mr. Santos was sitting on a warm brown leather couch, a wool blanket pulled up to his neck, his legs extended on a footrest. He was visibly clammy. When he first saw Ryu, something like fear passed his face, which he covered over with a defiant, impatient look. The doctor realized that he'd always seen Mr. Santos smiling, standing completely erect. The superintendent's features had never been more expressive, and he felt the superintendent's shame reflected back onto him. "What did I already tell you, Dr. Ryu? Mr. Santos asked me to take a look. I promise you, if this is not serious, we will leave you alone." "They're swelling, doctor." Mr. Santos nodded and looked away as Ryu moved the floor lamp closer and retrieved a pair of latex gloves, a stethoscope, and a flashlight from his bag. Mr. Santos flung his head back like a silent film damsel in distress as Ryu pulled off the wool blanket. Mr. Santos was outfitted in a white undershirt and pajama bottoms. The swelling on his lymph nodes startled Ryu. They looked like large blisters, each one the size of a robin's egg. Ryu could only recall seeing such swelling in photos. "I'm sorry to tell you this. I can't say for sure what it is, but you need to go to the hospital." Mrs. Santos was already putting on her coat. Ryu helped them into their Toyota Camry in the garage. When he saw another dead rat, he again removed latex gloves from his bag, slipped them on, and placed the rodent into the trash can. He stood impatiently in the elevator on his way back to his apartment. After thoroughly washing his hands and throwing his clothes in the wash, he joined his mother in front of the television. Thankfully, no explanations were required by Mrs. Ryu. The doctor slept poorly that night. In the morning, he took the elevator downstairs and knocked on the Santos' door. He was about to return to the elevator when the door opened. Mrs. Santos had gotten back from the hospital an hour ago. Mr. Santos was still under observation, and she would visit later this evening, she told him. Without explanation, Ryu asked for Mr. Santos' keys. She pointed to a loop by the door and handed them over. Ryu found his way to the supply closet where Mr. Santos kept his cleaning equipment. Ryu took the broom and dustpan and went down to the garage where he was able to collect 4 dead rats. There were also 2 dead squirrels and a dead raccoon. He wrapped them up in 2 garbage bags, threw them in the trunk of his wife's Subaru, and delivered them to the incinerator in the suburbs. I'm just going to stop there. Thank you.
So next up is Michael Kaan. Michael was born in Winnipeg, the second child of a father from Hong Kong and a Canadian mother. The Water Beetles is his first novel and was listed as the most anticipated read by Quill and Choir, CBC Books, and 49th Shelf. The Water Beetles is based loosely on his father's wartime diaries and stories. So let us welcome Michael Kaan.
Thank you, everyone. I have to apologize. I've come down with a cold, so my voice is that. I'm slightly medicated as well, so I'll try to get through this at a decent pace. This book is about the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong starting in 1941, and it tells the story of a large and wealthy family who are forced to split up, and in particular, 4 children from the family are sent into rural China, presumably to be safe, but they turn out not to be safe. They eventually make it back home, but that's the substance of the story. The passage that I'm going to read is, I don't usually do this at readings, but this is a different audience, is right at the end. It's the last chapter. And they've come home, and this is actually sort of 10 years later. And the main character, Chong is now 22 years old, and he has been accepted at an American university to go study, so he's leaving home, and he hasn't told his mother yet. And he's also cleaning up his stuff, and he's going to discover, as you'll see here, something that he carried with him through the war the whole time, which is a gold belt buckle that was tarnished with mercury to disguise it, but his brother gave it to him just at the beginning of the war as security. That's a true story, by the way, so he's going to discover this in his room. A week later, I was cleaning up my room. The letter from the American University. The letter, now with a few more worried rips in it, lay folded on my dresser, and I avoided looking at it. I went through my room and found books and clothes I would no longer need. Most of what I had still descended from that time before the war, and I told myself my nephew might want some of it one day. I filled a box with things to discard. The old corner of the yard, where we had once thrown our trash and where the British had once dumped all their guns, had been cleared out and turned into a vegetable garden. I put the box in the hall, knowing Chow would take it out later. At the back of my closet, I found a small cloth bag. I picked it up and it felt very light, so I flipped it over and dumped the contents onto my bed. A polished rock fell out, and with a little extra shaking, my old belt landed on the quilt. My body went numb, and I stared at the belt for several minutes. My right hand drifted ghost-like over my stomach and plucked at my shirt. I hadn't seen it for years. Against the taut, crisp floral print of the quilt, it was pitifully dirty and old. I picked it up and examined the strap. The leather was cracked and frayed, and when I ran my thumb along its edge, a small shower of dirt sprayed onto my hand and sleeve. I stared at the dirt and tried to imagine where it had come from. The tarnish on the buckle was unchanged, still no darker after many years. I pressed my thumbnail against it, wanting to scrape it and see the gold shine through, but I hesitated, and instead rubbed my thumb over the brownish metal, feeling it warm in my hand. It was strange to see again this lifeless thing that had accompanied me in silence all that time. Though I had never used it, during that time it brought me both comfort and worry, and it was my guardian, my monument, and my wound. I toyed with the pin for a moment and rolled the belt back up. I weighed it in my hand a final time before putting it back in the bag. I brought it to his brother Chong and showed him. He stretched it out and looked at the strap with faint disgust, then looked closely at the buckle. "My God, I remember this thing," he said. "I guess you won't need this where you're going." He put it down and looked at me gravely. "You should talk to her soon." I shook my head in response to his first comment. "Yes, I'll talk to her." I took the belt from him and said, "Let me deal with this." I was surprised how easily the strap and buckle came apart. I only had to pull slightly against the old seam that wrapped around the buckle, and the strap split open and separated from the gold. Even the metal there was tarnished. Chong took the buckle and placed it casually on his desk. He said he would take it to the foundry our family owned and have it melted back and purified. That was the only way to remove the tarnish. I looked at the strap for a moment, and then I tossed it into the empty wastebasket by his desk. It lay half-coiled and dead against the wicker, and I tapped the basket lightly with my shoe as though to confirm I was done with it. It went out with the same garbage I had put outside my room. Most likely, it was all burned. The next morning after breakfast, I took the envelope off my dresser and went downstairs to find my mother in the library. I found her drinking tea and looking out at the garden, and I sat down on a stool across from her. I opened up the letter and handed it to her, though she could not read English. I told her I'd been accepted at a university in America and would be moving to California to study. I would be the first in our family to leave. I already had the ship's ticket and would be going in a few weeks, I said. She couldn't have been surprised, but she wrung her hands in her lap and blinked many times and looked away towards the garden. After a long silence, my mother, that artist of serenity, said she was very happy for me. She said she hoped one day to visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was from the Water Beetles. Giovanni Si is a playwright, director, actor, and the artistic director of Gateway Theater. His latest play, 9 Dragons, is a detective story set in the 1920s colonial Hong Kong, and it premiered at Vertical Theater in Calgary last September before going to Winnipeg's Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre and Gateway Theatre. 9 Dragons won a Jesse Richardson Award for Outstanding Original Script and was also nominated for a Betty Mitchell Award for Outstanding New Play. Giovanni's earlier play, A Taste of Empire, was nominated for 2 Dora Moore Awards, including Outstanding New Play. A Taste of Empire was translated into Cantonese and performed by Derek Chan, with Giovanni directing. This Cantonese version of A Taste of Empire toured to Toronto earlier this year, where it was also nominated for a Dora. A Taste of Empire and 9 Dragons are both published by Talon Books. Giovanni is currently co-writing a new play with Leanna Brody called Salesman in China, with the assistance of Playwrights Theatre Centre and the Stratford Festival. We will now hear from Giovanni Si.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Julia. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to read a short excerpt from an earlier play, A Taste of Empire. This is one that I wrote and first performed in 2010 in Toronto. What's a little unusual about A Taste of Empire is it was never intended to be performed in a proper theater, and in fact, never has been in any of its incarnations. I premiered the piece at the Miele Kitchen at the St. Lawrence Center Market in Toronto, which is a really swanky kitchen where you get celebrity chefs like Susur Lee and Danielle Boulud doing demonstrations. And then the conceit behind A Taste of Empire is you're all there to watch a cooking demonstration by world-renowned chef Maximo Cortez, who, as we learned in the introduction, is kind of the bad boy enfant terrible of the culinary world. Think Gordon Ramsay meets Augusto Pinochet kind of type guy. But Chef Maximo's not there because he's on a culinary emergency. Turns out he's cooking for Bono. And in his place, you see sous chef Giovanni doing the demonstration. Chef Maximo is the inventor of a philosophy of cooking called imperial cuisine, which is sort of the antithesis of ethical farm-to-table eating. The idea is you take up the largest footprint possible. And sous chef Giovanni is a very ardent cheerleader of this form of cooking. The dish we're making is called rellenong bangus. It is a Filipino fish dish. You take a flaky white fish, you take out all the meat, leaving the skin intact. Then you saute all the fish meat with very Spanish flavoring, put it back in the skin, and finish it. And I chose that dish because it seemed like the perfect metaphor for European colonization of Asia. So all I want to tell you contextually is while I read this is an actual demonstration. Imagine me cooking, imagine you can smell everything. And in fact, I do cook the dish from start to finish. It takes about 80 minutes and you eat it at the end. So the two elements we're missing as I'm reading are, there's a very real 9.5-inch chef's knife in one hand and real produce in the other during this section. And there's a monitor, which sometimes shows my hands in action, sometimes shows comic illustrations like you'd see on Weekend Update or The Daily Show. So at this point, I'm just preparing the mise en place for the dish. In fact, other than the soy sauce and the marinade, none of the ingredients in this dish are what you would normally think of as being especially Asian. And yet, Chef Maximo says, rellenong bangus is quintessentially Asian, a signature dish of the Philippines. So how did these Spanish flavors come to define a Filipino dish? The answer begins in 1521. It was in that year that, under the flag of Spain, the great explorer Ferdinand Magellan landed upon a cluster of 7,000 beautiful islands in the South China Sea. Magellan claimed this fertile land for the glory of Spain and its monarch, Philip II. Unfortunately, many of the indigenous people who happened to be there weren't ready to accept Spain's generous offer of civilization. Do you remember those stubborn old Aita? Well, these folks were even worse. And it was their stubbornness that forced Spain to cull thousands of lawless natives in order to keep the peace and bring them into the modern world, just as Spain had done with the backward savages of the Americas 30 years earlier. Now, when the Spanish arrived, indigenous farmers had this inefficient system where each family used its land to grow food to feed themselves. Yeah, they didn't know about cash crops, storing surpluses, or commodities trading. Well, Spain soon corrected that. For the benefit of the farmers, Spain took over their land and taught them the marvels of modern agriculture. No more growing cassava or yam to feed the kid. No, instead the land was to be used the way God intended, to create wealth. Now, the Spanish taught the natives how to grow profitable crops like sugarcane, tobacco, and coffee, and soon money was flowing all the way back to Spain. Now, I know some of you smarty pants are thinking, hey, you can't eat tobacco, but the Spanish had already thought of that, and in exchange for their crops, provided the farmers with the chance to buy food, all at a low cost, plus a little extra for shipping and handling. And since the farmers found that lots of caffeine and cigarettes helped keep them alert in the fields, they were able to buy back the coffee, sugar, and tobacco that they grew, plus a little extra for refining raw material. And Spain even allowed the farmers to squat on their former land in exchange for tending the fields, plus a little extra for rent and supplies. Now, I hear some of you thinking, hey, that sounds like a lot of extras, but Chef Maximo teaches us Every valuable lesson comes at a price. And he's right. I mean, it wasn't fun that time the master locked me in the walk-in freezer overnight, but now I never forget to close the freezer door. Yeah, so there were a few sacrifices for the Filipinos, but think of all the gifts they got in return, like the gift of eternal salvation. Spanish priests stripped the islanders of all their nutty false idols and taught them the love of our one true Savior, Jesus Christ. And with that came the gift of Christian modesty. Instead of running around half naked in see-through piña cloth, Spain gave the islanders clothing made from sturdy cottons and thick Spanish wools designed specifically for the tropics. And of course, Spain bestowed the gift of their cuisine, adobo, guisado, caldereta, sofrito. So that's how Spanish flavors came to define a Filipino dish. You know what's funny, though? Although sofrito is a flavor we identify as Spanish, none of its ingredients actually come from Spain. Just as Spain spread so many blessings throughout its empire, so too did they receive blessings from earlier empires. This garlic, onion, and olive oil all originated in Central Asia and were introduced into the Iberian Peninsula around 2000 BC, probably by one of the great seafaring empires, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carcinogens. So here, we thought that rellenong bangus was an Asian dish with European ingredients when all of the ingredients were Asian to begin with. All except this. The tomato is native to South and Central America. The first domesticated variety was grown in central Mexico by the Aztecs. Many species of tomatoes were present throughout the continent by the time Columbus landed, and Spain civilized the Mayans, Aztecs, and Ninjas. Now, at first, the Spaniards were afraid that this new world fruit was poisonous. Or maybe they thought it would turn them red like all those Aztecs. But after a while, they saw that their loyal subjects in the Philippines weren't dying or turning red, so they figured it was probably safe to give it a try. So this tomato we think of as Spanish comes from an American seed that was transplanted to both Asia and to Europe. The story of the tomato is the story of the wonders of empire. Only by commanding a vast realm spanning 3 continents and having the power of life and death over millions of vassals could Spain make the tomato such a beloved fruit to so many. And Chef Maximo says that's what imperial cuisine is all about. Taking all the goodness of the earth and letting the bounties trickle down. Hey, look at us. We're making a sofrito. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. That was so entertaining. So are you going to be doing something like this tomorrow?
A little bit more of it. And then
A little more? Okay, and so 9 Dragons and this one, A Taste of Empire. Cool. So everybody will be showing up for that, right? Okay, our next speaker is Vincent Ternida. He was a finalist for the Writers Guild Canada's Diverse Screenwriters Program West in 2012 to 13, and a second rounder for the Austin Film Festival's Television Spec Script Contest in 2013. When he's not writing for his webcomic, Over the Counter, he's working on short stories and a new screenplay. Vincent lives in Vancouver, and he will now read for us.
So who is Harry Salcido? He is East Van Strong, Hastings Sunrise represent. He's a coffee addict, like most Vancouverites, I guess. And he thinks he's a player. I don't know. Let's find out. So I'll be reading from when he journeys southeast, not west. So it's a little later in the book. Caveat, Harry is not me, and I'm not Harry. I don't know how many people get that idea. I don't know. Anyway, Christmas carols started in September in Manila. From Mariah Carey to the famed local crooner Jose Marie Chan. All the merry melodies and jingles filled the malls and restaurants with astounding merriment. I was already goddamn sick of it. I spent the next few days after completing my mission just lying in bed, recovering from my injuries. My teeth still ached even after getting them checked out. I visited the restaurant in Binondo a lot just to check out the server. I tried to be friendly and even left good tips, but she stopped serving me after a while. The other servers probably warned her when I showed up, so I stopped coming. I thought about seeking out Charlie, but I was betting she wouldn't be interested in talking. I watched a lot of local TV at the communal kitchen, and when the water in the apartment was rationed in rotating shifts due to the water shortage, I even made small talk with the residents. My Tagalog was rusty, but they warmed up to me and even joked around. It was as if it was more of a dormitory than an apartment, to be honest. Most of the men and the older women were keen on the small talk. Younger women kept their distance, and the ones who were curious chatted in either small groups or with their boyfriend. They asked me about Canada, what I ate there, how I lived, and if I was raking in the dough. Most of my money went to coffee, alcohol, and rent, I explained. We also chatted about basketball, local showbiz, and even politics. I made sure I agreed to whatever side they adhered to. I didn't want to be found shot dead and gift wrapped for the world to see. After a while, some of the more curious men asked me if I had a girlfriend, and if so, whether she was Canadian, meaning white. It was strange. I wondered how Canadian-born and raised Filipinos would react. I usually responded no, and I would be asked to meet a female family member, wanting to be friends. I politely declined and went about my business. I understood where they were coming from. I did live in the Philippines for a bit, so I considered myself Filipino. Even with my blue passport, it took a while to warm up to the idea that I was Canuck. Living in Vancouver for a good decade helped. Thank you.
Last but not least, we have Madeleine Thien. Madeleine was born in Vancouver. She is the author of the story collection Simple Recipes and 3 novels, Certainty, Dogs at the Perimeter, and Do Not Say We Have Nothing. Dogs at the Perimeter was shortlisted for the Berlin International Literature Prize and winner of the Frankfurt Book Fair's 2015 Sorry, I don't speak German, so Liberative Prize, is that right?
Literatur Prize.
Thank you. Her latest novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, I'm sure everybody's heard of it, is about musicians studying Western classical music at the Shanghai Conservatory in the 1960s and the legacy of the 1989 Tiananmen Square demonstrations. Do Not Say We Have Nothing won the 2016 Giller Prize and the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction. This is a long list. So let's see if I can get through it. An Edward Stanford Prize. It was shortlisted for the 2016 Man Booker Prize, the 2017 Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, and the Folio Prize. The novel was named a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2016 and longlisted for a Carnegie Medal. Her books and stories are published in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and I'm sure many other places, and has been translated into 25 languages. We are honored to have Madeleine here.
It's so wonderful to be back, and I have a lot of memories because when I was a child, I studied Chinese calligraphy, painting, and I was part of the Chinese dance troupe here at the Cultural Center, and we danced in all the parades. So it's wonderful to be back. I'll just read briefly from Do Not Say We Have Nothing. In this part, it's 1949 Shanghai. A man was sent earlier to the United States to study. He came back to China with loads and loads and loads of books. He died too soon. He was given the nickname Old West, and he left a daughter named Little West. Little West grew up terrified of her father's books, as if they held a disease that could destroy a village. Little West packed the books into a container and buried the lot of them. Her only son, born long after she had given up hope of a child, was the apple of her eye, and she hoped he would grow up to be a proper landlord like his great uncles. Instead, the boy lost his head to poetry. The boy was a walking cartload of books. He sat at his desk, calligraphy brush in hand, gazing up at the ceiling as if waiting for words to swallow him. His bedroom appeared to float, disconnected, above the solid world of transactions, commerce, and land. She called him, sometimes gently, sometimes roughly, Wen the Dreamer. He was an observant and sensitive teenager, and when the war came, it broke him. In 1949, when the fighting ended, Little West sent him to Shanghai, hoping it would restore his vigor. Books made all his pockets heavy. When acquaintances met him on the road, Wen said he couldn't stop to discuss the communists or the nationalists, Stalin, Truman, or the weather, because he was composing a 6-character, 8-line regulated verse in his head, and any variation in his path would push the words out of order. It was a lie. In fact, he was empty of poetry and afraid of words. During the war, Bingpai had been ravaged by the worst famine in a century, but he himself had never known hunger. He had sat in his study, memorizing ancient and modern verses, while outside, laborers ate nothing but tree bark, mothers sold their children, and young boys died horrifying deaths on the front lines. Half the village of Bingpai starved to death, but the gentry, inheritors of seemingly limitless resources, survived. Now the Shanghai literati were talking about a new kind of poetry, a revolutionary literature worthy of a reborn nation, and the idea of it both moved and troubled him. Could the avant-garde express the ideas that went unspoken? Could it confront the hypocrisy of lives like theirs? He did not know. When his poems came back from one of the revolutionary journals, a thick brush had scrawled across the page, "Excellent calligraphy, but your poems still sleep in their pastoral prison. Moon this, wind that, and who cares about your bloody grandfather? Wake up." He knew they were right. Wen kept the rejection letter and threw the poems away. He remembered Bertolt Brecht. "I would also like to be wise. In the old books it says what wisdom is, to shun the strife of the world and to live out your brief time without fear. All this I cannot do." By chance, he wandered into the New World Tea House. A young woman was singing, and Wen the Dreamer, perplexed and enchanted, listened to her for 5 straight hours. Afterwards, he wanted to speak to her, to commend the harsh beauty of her music, but with what words? The young woman's music contained poetry and the written word, and yet it traveled far beyond them to a realm, a silence he had believed inexpressible. Wen wanted to call out to her, but instead he watched her disappear alone up a flight of stairs. Nothing had shifted. The world was still the same. And yet, walking home, Wen felt as if his life had snapped in two. He stood for a long time looking at the muddy, sleepless river, which in the darkness was only a sound, trying to understand what had changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. Who, in your opinion, are 3 essential authors to read if one is interested in understanding the Asian diasporic experience, and why do you think they are important?
Okay,
Kevin.
I might go with 4, just because I'm keener. Paul Yee's A Superior Man, which is a wonderful look at the earliest Asian immigrant experience, the railroads in Canada. And then I think Jenny Zhang's Sour Heart, which I read last year, which is really funny, and I feel like I think she's in her 30s, like early 30s, and I feel like this generational shift, because I'm in my 40s, because it's very sort of rude and scatological and funny, and something that's similar to that is Lindsay Wong's The Woo Woo, which was nominated for the Hillary Western Awards, a nonfiction book, and it's, again, very sort of like rude and very sort of different from a lot of Asian, North American works of literature where parents are treated very respectfully. I think that's in contrast to the final book I'll list, because I really like this book, Min Jin Lee's Pachinko, which is about a family of Koreans, 3 generations of Koreans who live in Japan, and the kind of the discrimination they face, and yeah, all the parents are very, very selfless in the book, and it's an engrossing story, and it's also a story that shows that the Asian diaspora isn't something that just exists within North America or even the English-speaking world, that exists in Asia and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I was jotting down notes furiously as you were talking. I think Pachinko is coming out as a movie sometime soon.
It'll be a good movie.
Yeah.
Hopefully it'll be a mini-series, because there's so many stories.
Yes, that would be great. After the success of Crazy Rich Asians, I think this is the moment for Asian writers. So the next person we will hear from is Michael Kaan. Who are your choices for essential writers?
I have to admit, when I got the question, I was a bit stumped, because I in terms of my reading habits, I haven't read that widely in writers of Asian descent. I'm half Chinese. I'm also half Irish, so I've read a lot of Irish writers. They're easy to find. And I try to read pretty broadly. Actually, most of what I read I try to read literature in translation as much as possible. I recently read an Arabic novel called The Corpse Washer. But in terms of Asian writers, the first one that came to mind, and I think I'll just stick with one because I don't want to speak out of turn, is the Chinese-American author Ken Liu, who is from Luzhou, and moved to the United States with his family when he was 11. He's now a tax lawyer in Boston. And he's a writer of short stories. He has a sort of magical realist science fiction side to what he writes, a bit of sort of influenced by Jorge Luis Borges. And he published a beautiful short story collection called The Glass Menagerie, which I recommend to all of you. And the title story, The Glass Menagerie, is about a young boy whose parents are Chinese immigrants, and his mother, who is not educated and kind of a sad person, entertains him by creating these sort of beautiful paper animals, and he builds up a repertoire of these animals, which in his mind are real. They move around and they interact, and he plays with them. And later on, something happens, and the animals come to life again, and he discovers the very sad story of her immigration to America from China, that she was essentially put into a forced marriage and so on. And many of his other stories talk about the difficulty of the immigrant experience, which I know is sort of a standard thing for writers of an ethnic background to write about. But I think more engagingly, he also writes stories that draw on elements of Chinese mythology or Chinese folktales, interweaving them with things like steampunk and so on. So he's the one writer that I would mention. I highly recommend him. And the name of the collection again is The Glass Menagerie.
Next up, let's put the same question to Giovanni.
Thanks, Julia. I'm going to pick 3 dramatists because that's my milieu, and I'm quite consciously not going to choose David Henry Hwang as one of them, because I think it's widely acknowledged he is probably the godfather of American Asian playwriting as the first real celebrity, best known author. So the 3 I'm going to pick, and I can't even. This was very hard because I can't think of 3 that I would consider representative of the breadth of work out there. So I just picked 3 that I really enjoy for very different reasons, who are quite different writers. I'll say the first is Young Jean Lee, the Korean-American playwright, who recently had her show Straight White Men open on Broadway in June, becoming the first Asian American woman to be produced on Broadway. And I love her because of the way she plays with form. Like, she's not just looking at real cutting-edge questions about identity and the politics of identity, but she's also playing with theatrical form in a way that a lot of her contemporaries don't. So she's somebody I would say definitely read. I picked the Vietnamese-American playwright Quy Nguyen, who He's had a piece called Viet Gone, which was performed at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, among other places last year, and I think it's opening at Manitoba Theatre Centre in Winnipeg in October with its Canadian debut. And his company, Vampire Cowboy Theatre, is just, it's raucous fun. He really was, he grew up on manga, anime, kung fu movies, and that kind of spirit infects all of his writing. So it's a really different kind of playful, really vibrant kind of writing. And then for my third choice, a Canadian writer, David Yee, and you know, he's written a number of wonderful plays, but the one I'd really recommend reading is Carried Away on the Crest of a Wave, which is the play that won him the Governor General's Award for drama. He was the first Asian Canadian playwright to win that Governor General's award. And what I love about David's writing is it's always informed by a real sense of anger, but it's still he puts there's a hilarity to it that I think doesn't make the underlying anger overwhelming, and they're real just a range, especially that play, which is 9 separate short stories. You'd just be amazed at the difference in tone and style between those 9 short plays. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Great recommendations, because I think most of us are not we don't read plays very often, so it's great to expand our horizons.
Yeah. So my first choice is Catherine Hernandez, because not only does it represent Filipinos as a whole, but also represents the LGBT community. She wrote Scarborough. It showed like the entire working class set up in the East, and also one character, Bing, who is learning about his sexual identity. Like it was a really moving book, and I got it all from TED. And so my second one is kind of a 2-part author. One is Lorena Mapa, Canadian graphic artist, and on the other side of the coin is Jessica Hagedorn. Why I chose them is because of that big martial law stigma. Like as a people, we have that collective trauma, and to understand the Filipino-Canadian, Filipino-American diaspora, that's like just identifying that martial law stigma from the 70s with just that pain that collectively we experience. And then finally, Miguel Sijuko, he wrote Ilustrados. Probably the closest one that I would, mark for Jose Rizal, which is our hero back in the day. It reminds me of his books, El Filibusterismo, that idea of not like when an immigrant not only moves to a country, but also tries to return to the home country with what they've learned, and not really trying to save it, but also trying to educate people back home.
Thank you. So could I get you to say the second two?
Lorena Mapa, and on the other side of the coin, Jessica Hagedorn.
Okay, thank you. Everybody caught those names? And for your information, Catherine Hernandez was an Emerging Writer Award winner. ACWW awarded her the Emerging Writers Award, I think, was it 2 years ago? And that's how she got published. So thank you for mentioning her. And Madeleine, your thoughts?
I totally didn't follow instructions. I just have a whole list of names. Also because I found it almost impossible to constrain to 3, just because of the vastness of the different kinds of work being done, and what's being written in English versus what's being written in other languages from the Asian diaspora. So I'll just go nuts. But for my own self, I think one of the writers who's most influenced me is the Chinese writer Ma Jian, who now lives in London. I guess he would be classified with the dissident Chinese writers, but Michael mentioned The Corpse Walker. I think Lao Yiwu, also one of the great Chinese writers, and all of their works, I would say. But for me, it was Ma Jian's Red Dust, and later Beijing Coma. And then just here, Go Po Seng, who lived in Vancouver for so long, Singaporean, Canadian writer, Denise Chong, Wei Sin Choi, etc. Karen Tae Yamashita in the United States, I Hotel. Eileen Chang. I'm just thinking across the generations too, and the different arrival times. A more recent writer, the Singaporean writer Amanda Lee Koh, who lives in the United States now. For me, also a big influence has been Cambodian writers. So Vade Ratner, In the Shadow of the Banyan, Long Ong, First They Killed My Father, and Ritipan, who writes in French, and he's also a filmmaker. His book is The Elimination. And Ian Lee. Ian Lee has been a major influence on me, Chinese-American writer. And another writer I love, Yoko Towada, who writes in Japanese and German and lives, I think, between the two places. She has a wonderful book called The Naked Eye. Sorry, it was just so many. Yeah.
Wow, you should get that list posted somewhere. Is that doable, Ellen? Yeah, that would be great. All right, so let me turn to some questions that the audience has posed. This one's just for Kevin. Thank you. Yeah, special. Says Diaspora seems to require a lot of research. Can you describe what research you did to create your novel?
I read another book and just ripped off the storyline. And I called it an homage. It's kind of, that's half true. But I wrote about an epidemic, and I set it in Vancouver, and it was based on another novel. And so I kind of looked at sort of the history of epidemics and infectious disease in this area. I read a little bit of my book about how when George Vancouver arrived at the turn of the 18th century, that this area was actually already decimated by, I think, smallpox. Sort of swept North America. And so there's this sort of, the conquest of this area is built on that. And then I talk about, more recently, I look at a little bit at how SARS spread in southern China to Hong Kong, and then to the different sort of places around the world. And I talked to doctors and physicians about their work, but yeah, I think that's the extent of my research. I had a doctor as a character, and I was a little worried about that. But I just decided the character wouldn't be too much. He wouldn't speak too much about his work, and that's kind of. I think you actually read books about doctors, and they don't go into great details about their technique, and so I decided to do that. And there's a little sort of thread about Chinese opera, so I read up about Chinese opera, Cantonese opera in my book. So I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So this next question is for everybody on the panel, and let's go backwards with the alphabet this time. If you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would you tell them? Or he, she? Madeleine?
It's okay to cry. Yeah, that's what I'd tell them. You'll cry a lot. I've been so lucky to teach in different places, and one of the teaching I most loved was when I taught at City University of Hong Kong. And it was a low residency MFA, and the students about half of them were based in Hong Kong, and then the other half were kind of based around the world. And what I loved was that they were bringing different canons into the classroom, and they all had access to quite a few languages, and quite a few were working in English, which was their third language or fourth or something like this. So they were also expanding the syntax of what the language could do. And I think maybe I I would tell my younger self that English is an astonishingly flexible language, and it can hold many conceptual frameworks, but there's a kind of courage that it takes to push the boundaries of what the language could do, and to not be afraid of your thoughts that go against the grain of the times.
Okay. What are your thoughts, Michael?
So the question is, what would I tell my younger self?
Yes.
My younger self or my younger writing self?
Writing self.
Well, I began writing 3 years ago, so it wasn't that young. Unfortunately, very clear memories of the past 3 years. So, I would say, just so. I guess the background is, since I was a kid, I always wanted to write. It was always very attractive to me, but I never kind of did it. And then at some point in my early 40s, I said, you know what, you better do this, to summarize it. And so I got down to it, and I struggled for a while with trying to figure out what to do, because I think I felt a lot of sort of external pressure to do this a certain way or do a certain way. And really all I would say is just do what you want to do. Like, it's a rare opportunity to really commit yourself to something completely and treat it as something very, very personal. Because initially I tried to write more sort of, fiction with more general appeal. And when I began writing The Water Beetles, I discovered that I wanted to write it much more genuinely and was much more committed to it, because it was about not just a family story, but I think it was the kind of thing that I wanted to write. So that would be my advice, is don't worry about anything else, just write what you think you need to be writing.
Supposed to go to Vincent next. Vincent, what do you think?
Okay, I'm gonna keep this PG. First, finish your goddamn work. Second, try to be humble. And third, stop being Vince. But, Vince, what do you think, Vince? I don't know. Stop spending time on social media. I think 20 years ago, I think that was 2003, you were on Friendster. Now it's Facebook. I don't know what's next. Just write something. MySpace, just write something. Damn it, just write something and finish it. Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. And Giovanni, what do you have to say about this?
I think I'd tell my younger self, if you want to write a play more frequently than once every 5 years, don't run a theater company. I just learned that recently. But I think the honest thing is choose collaborators very selectively. I think writing a play is quite different. Probably, I'm presuming because I haven't written a novel, but I imagine it's different in that we have a lot more, it's much more of a collaborative form where you get a lot of hands in the pie, if you will, and we work with multiple dramaturges, which are kind of like our editors for plays, and then young writers, I think, are really susceptible to taking advice from anybody who could potentially produce the play, because that's the ultimate aim, it's not actually not to get it published, it's to get it produced. So we're very susceptible to taking any stray bit of advice from anybody who's remotely interested. And the advice I'd give to any young playwright is really stick to your vision, have it really clear, and choose your collaborators wisely.
Thank you. And Kevin?
I'd buy a house in East Van and get Apple stock or maybe Amazon stock, and I'd just be just laughing right now. I wouldn't be here. I'd just be in my yacht. I'm not sure I would do things. I don't think I'd really do things too much differently or tell myself anything, because I think I had to be that fool like whatever 15, 20 years ago in my earlier 20s self to sort of arrive at whatever wisdom I have. I guess the only thing I would say is maybe to read more widely at an earlier age. I think I had these sort of really preset notions of who produced the literature, who produced literature and who produced the literature I wanted to emulate, and it was a very sort of narrow sort of demographic. And as I've gotten older, I've sort of could step away from that, and I really am realizing how much I've been missing out, or how much I had missed out on, and how many great writers there are in the world, and how many great writers have lived in the world, and that's well, I think the only regret I really have. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. So two people in the audience asked Madeleine a very similar question. So I'll read both of the questions and you can respond as you will. Do not say we had nothing describes music so vividly and poetically. What is your personal connection with music? And then the other person asked, can you describe your process in creating the dialogue of the musicians in your book, in particular how they think and talk about music?
I had piano lessons for a year when I was 6, and we must have been really terrible because the piano lessons ended soon after. But I did learn to read music, so I can basically read sheet music. But my relationship with classical music was always through ballet, because I studied ballet for 15 years. I don't know how I wish I could answer that question well. I think, you know, that's the weird thing about writing fiction, is that you learn a lot from these characters that ostensibly you've created, but in a strange way they're teaching you how to see the world in a completely different way. And I feel like they taught me how to listen, and they taught me how to live through music, and they taught me what words cannot actually express, and where language actually falls short. And I think that's what I tried to express as best as I could through the way that they love and try to stay true to that music.
Thank you. This question is for everyone. Obviously, there are some aspiring writers in the audience. The question is, was it difficult to share your writing with others at first? And if it was, how did you overcome this? So we just go down the table, not to put you on the spot, right?
I haven't learned how to overcome it at all. It's strange because I started as a performer and still perform, and I've never had stage fright as a performer ever. But even to this day, the first time people sit and read that first draft of a script, and first drafts of scripts are so awful, but it's we kind of, I mean, as dramatists, we expose our writing, I think, a lot earlier to people than it should be, but that's the only way it really improves is the iteration of hearing it out loud with actors and having that kind of feedback. But it's a sickening feeling, and I haven't learned how to negotiate the sheer terror of being that vulnerable and having something so completely unready to be shared actually out there. So.
I didn't share my stories until, I was an undergraduate at UBC, and I remember, before and after every workshop, I would be locked in a bathroom stall, just like shaking, terrified. And I remember my first workshop was actually for Simple Recipes, that first short story in my first book, but it was in a very different form back then. And I remember someone saying, there's quite a violent act that happens in that story, and I remember someone saying, I have no idea what I was supposed to take out of this story. Like, you took me to this really dark place and then kind of left me with nothing. And I really didn't understand what the point of reading this story was. And it was such a painful thing to hear, but she had hit on something profoundly true. I also didn't know why I was putting this into the world and why this wound should be shared. I didn't know, and it took me a long time to think about. It was the harshest piece of criticism I ever received. Not ever, but it was one that really stuck with me, and I think has informed a lot of what I try to do.
As a writer, I'm not sure I've ever felt undue pressure. I don't know if I've done that. I think if anything, the challenge I've faced as an Asian Canadian playwright have been, say I'm being produced by a producer who doesn't really kind of understand the whole cultural context of my work, and then I have to end up educating them on, no, that really wouldn't happen on stage with an actual Chinese Canadian family. Or, it's that trying to get people to understand things that they don't think about or don't know, because I don't know what they don't know. But I don't think anybody's ever sort of said, ramp up the Asianness or represent, because no, if anything, I'd be thrilled if there was more, I'm not sure, like, I don't even know what that would look like in terms of my work. And the only other thing I could say is, since I started, it's a really great time for Asian Canadian drama. There's a lot of fantastic writers who I feel are representing by their numbers, because it's impossible for one person to represent the depth of the Asian diaspora, diasporic experience. It's foolish to think that you can be that one person who speaks for everybody. So I'm really glad that there's such a proliferation of different voices.
Thank you so much, panel. It's been great, very entertaining and informative, and I'm sure the audience joins me in thanking you.